Guadalcanal begins in darkness. Not just the midnight that soaked the palms and Kenai grass along Taivu Point, but a darkness of certainty, the unshakable belief that Americans would crack at night and run before bayonets. On August 19, 1942, under that canopy and in that certainty, a Japanese second lieutenant, call him what the records suggest he might have been, young, educated, a veteran of China, opened a diary and tried to capture what would not fit on the page, the feeling that everything he had been taught about war was about to be tested. He and roughly 900 more from Colonel Kaineo Ichiki's detachment had slipped ashore from destroyers east of the American perimeter. They had been promised an easy victory. Intelligence briefings said the enemy numbered perhaps 2,000, soft men from a soft nation, untrained, over-equipped, uneasy in the dark. Their commander dismissed caution. Reinforcements would only slow the righteous sweep of battle. "These are Americans," he was quoted as saying. "We will throw them into the sea." The island that would write a different truth is a long blade of volcanic green, 90 miles by 25, its spine lifting into cloud. On paper, the objective was simple: seize the nearly finished airfield on the coastal plain, build a perimeter, hold until relieved. In reality, Guadalcanal would become a 6-month crucible that tested appetite, systems, and will. The Americans came first. On August 7th, the 1st Marine Division landed near Lunga Point in Operation Watchtower, the first U.S. offensive of the Pacific War. They found the airfield, soon to be named Henderson Field for Marine Aviator Major Lofton Henderson, lightly defended. Construction crews and naval troops withdrew into the jungle, leaving machinery and stocks the Marines turned to immediate use. Within days, Wildcats and Dauntless began to arrive, the embryo of the Cactus Air Force, named for the code name Cactus given to the island. But the sea cut back. On the night of August 9th, in black water off Savo Island, Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa's cruisers burst through Allied screens and tore into a formation at anchor. In less than an hour, for heavy cruisers, HMAS Canberra and the American ships Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes were lost, and more than 1,000 sailors died. It was the worst defeat in U.S. Navy history to that point in a surface action. The escorting force withdrew, and with them went much of the Marines' food, ammunition, and equipment still on the transports. On shore, the men paced the perimeter and listened to the thunder of the jungle, surf, rain, insects, and the cough of engines on unfinished runways. They were, for the moment, alone. Japanese headquarters recognized the airfield as the hinge of everything. Control the strip and daylight belonged to whichever side could fly from it. Night would favor the Imperial Navy's fast destroyers, the Tokyo Express, but day would belong to Cactus. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hayakate's 17th Army received the order: retake Henderson before the Americans hardened their position. Ichiki's regiment, veterans, proud, trained to close with the bayonet, was closest. He had orders to wait for the balance of his regiment. He did not wait. Destroyers put 917 men ashore near Taivu Point, about 15 miles east of the Marine lines. Patrols fanned out into a jungle that hid everything and deceived with scale. The same day, along the coastal track, a Marine patrol under Captain Charles Brush collided with Japanese scouts in a brief, violent exchange. The Marines killed several dozen and brought back papers that said something more important than numbers. The Japanese thought there were only a few thousand Marines here. General Alexander Vandegrift did not need the papers to sense what was coming. The likely approach was from the east, along the Ilu River, misnamed Tenaru on Marine maps, and Alligator Creek in the telling that followed, where a shallow sandbar invited a night crossing. He strengthened the line with Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2 of 1 Marines and placed heavy, water-cooled Browning M1917 machine guns to knit the sandbar into interlocking arcs of fire. Mortars registered. A 37mm gun had canisters stacked beside it, each round a giant shotgun shell intended to smash a charge flat. After midnight on August 21st, a ragged figure stumbled into Marine lines. Jacob Vuza, a Solomon Islander scout and former policeman, had been interrogated and tortured, then escaped. He gasped a warning. The Japanese were coming in strength. Minutes later, the jungle erupted. Rifles flashed. Grenades tumbled. Men shouted and ran into a geometry that had been drawn for them. The Brownings began. A water-cooled heavy gun is a brute built for endurance. As long as the jacket held water and belts were fed, they would fire and fire again, a steady 600 rounds per minute that stitched a river of heat across the sand. Japanese infantry surged forward with courage sharpened by doctrine. Some reached the Marine line and lunged under wire and gun shields, and their men fought with fists and knives. But the fields overlapped. Every space that opened became a trap. When silhouettes clustered at the far bank, canister from the 37mm turned flesh into spray. Dawn revealed what the night had made. Bodies slumped in the water and on the sand, equipment scattered, rifles pointing nowhere. Of some 917 who had landed, roughly 800 were dead on and around the sandbar. Colonel Ichiki died with them. Accounts differ on whether by his own hand after burning colors or shot in the final madness. Marine losses were serious, but small by comparison. The psychological effect moved faster than any dispatch. Captured diaries, fragments of field orders, and the stunned interrogations of a few survivors spoke the same theme. The Americans had not broken at night. They had not panicked at the shout and steel of a rush. They had used the darkness, through overlapping guns, through mortars and pre-laid artillery, to make the jungle itself part of their weapons. In the days after Tenerife, the sea resumed its nightly rhythm. Destroyers slashed down the slot from the Shortlands and dropped men at Taivu and Coley points. The Tokyo Express proved brilliant at moving soldiers, terrible at moving what soldiers needed to fight. Heavy guns, vehicles, even sufficient rice were difficult to cram onto spray-swept decks. Men arrived carrying ammunition they could count. Artillery shells came in handfuls instead of stacks. Quinine was precious, plasma almost non-existent. On the American side, daylight brought transports, fuel drums, crates of rations, canvas, medical gear, interrupted at times, nearly strangled in August and early September, but then increasingly reliable as the Cactus Air Force kept bombers and ships honest. The next shock came not at a sandbar, but along a ridge that rose from the jungle like a saw-toothed spine. Marine intelligence and the instincts of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, commander of the Marine Raiders, pointed to that ridge as the likely approach from the south. On September 12th, Major General Kyote Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade, freshmen fed in by nighttime destroyers, launched a coordinated night attack with the main effort up that ridge. Edson had placed about 840 raiders and parachutists along its coral knobs and narrow saddles, and he had prepared it like Tenerife, machine guns to enfilade, mortars to break up concentrations, artillery plotted close, dangerously close, to his own lines. The ridge became a furnace. In the black, shapes materialized out of kanai grass and ravines. Marines felt breath on their faces before they saw forms. At points, small groups broke through. At others, entire companies rolled up steep slopes and smashed into a line that bent, thinned, and then held. Edson moved along the crest, steadying companies, sending ammunition where it was needed most. The fight flickered and burned into morning. He pulled the line back a few dozen yards to a tighter curve and prepared to absorb the next blow. It came, heavier, and was thrown back again, at such close quarters that shrapnel from Marine artillery wounded Marines and Japanese alike. When the smoke drifted away, perhaps 800. Japanese bodies lay tangled in the grasses and scrub. 2 Marines would receive the Medal of Honor for those nights, Colonel Edson and Major Kenneth D. Bailey, who led and fell with his men. The place entered the Marine vocabulary as Edson's Ridge, or simply Bloody Ridge. 4 Japanese soldiers who survived both disasters. The lesson cut against everything they had been drilled to believe. Night was no longer theirs alone. Courage and closeness did not trump prepared fire. The enemy fought as a system. Infantry drawn like wire across the right ground. Mortars to tear up concentrations before they could cohere. Artillery that arrived within minutes on coordinates already measured. And, hovering above in daylight, aircraft that found and punished every attempt to build momentum. October raised the stakes. General Hyakute came forward to personally oversee a larger effort to break Henderson Field. On the west, tanks tried to crash the Matanikau line and were smashed by anti-tank guns and an M3 Stuart that seemed to appear wherever needed. South of the field, under Lieutenant Colonel Lewis, Chesty, Puller, and with the newly arrived 164th Infantry from the Army, American lines stretched thin. At one point, only a single embattled battalion stood between the enemy and the runway. The night of 24 to 25 October became legend. Machine gun belts ran empty and were dragged forward again through tracer and palm splinter. When guns jammed or overheated, men grabbed rifles and kept the line alive. Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone took the worst corner of the fight into his own hands, carrying ammunition through fire, repairing weapons under pressure, leading counterattacks by pistol and will. He helped keep the corridor closed. Morning showed thousands of Japanese dead south of the strip, and the line still there, ragged and dreadful. But intact, Basilone would receive the Medal of Honor, and the 7th Marines and the 164th would be forever braided into the story of Henderson Field. While the ground froze into stalemate and slaughter, the sea turned into a classroom for a different lesson. In mid-November, as Japan mounted heavy bombardment and reinforcement runs, American ships learned to fight by radar in a way no Navy had done before. On November 13th, in a savage night melee, both sides lost cruisers and destroyers. American Admirals Norman Scott and Daniel Callahan died with their ships, and the battleship High was wrecked and finished by daylight aircraft. On the 14th to 15th, when the battleship Kurashima tried to force another bombardment, USS Washington found her in the dark and, guided by radar, walked 16-inch shells into the target until the Japanese ship died in thunder and steam. More decisive still, American planes and guns shattered a large transport convoy. Only a few ships reached the beaches, and those were smashed before they could unload. For the men starving in the jungle, that failure meant something more than a tactical defeat. It meant there would be no salvation by mass and material. By December, Japanese diaries that had once exuded confidence had narrowed into entries about food. Rice rations dwindled to a ball a day. Men boiled leaves. They ate palm hearts, grass, and roots. Quinine ran out. Malaria ran wild. In rough field hospitals, surgeons amputated without anesthetic, and corpsmen wrote names they knew could not be sent home. American units suffered, too, malaria, dysentery, jungle rot, abscesses, but their medical system bled off the worst, rotated men when they broke, and kept units fighting with plasma, sulfa drugs, and evacuation chains that reached ships and bases far from the front. An American machine gun could burn out a barrel and have a replacement before dusk. A Japanese light machine gun might be withheld for fear of running out of ammunition. The technical differences mattered inside the human ones. Japanese infantry carried Arisaka rifles, reliable, accurate, but slow in close firefights. Marines began with Springfields and increasingly received the semi-automatic M1 Garand with 8 rounds that came as quickly as a finger could work. The heavy Browning M1917S, married to water cans and ammunition belts that seemed to have no end, made fixed positions lethal beyond sight lines. In the hills behind the lines, 75mm pack howitzers broke down and hauled by hand could appear where Japanese doctrine said guns could not go. Forward observers, crouched behind stumps with field phones or radios, translated map coordinates into steel and fragmentation within minutes. Offshore, cruisers and destroyers waited for calls that would push a fence of shells out in front of an infantry line like moving armor. Overhead, Wildcats, P-39/P-0 Airacobras, P-4s, and Dauntless, patched together under sun and rain by the Cactus Air Force, fought bombers at the ragged end of their range from Rabaul, and hammered anything foolish enough to move in daylight. By January 1943, the strategic verdict was in. Major General Alexander Patch's 14 Corps, Marines and Army together, pressed forward in coordinated attacks. The Japanese position, drained by disease and starved to transparency, could not absorb the blows. In Tokyo and Rabaul, leaders faced a choice between a public admission of failure or a quiet acceptance of reality. They chose the latter. The evacuation plan was coded Operation Coup. In early February, destroyers came again, not to feed the line, but to pull it out. Over 3 nights, more than 10,000 men were removed from the island in one of the war's most skillful withdrawals. For those who left, the rescue was also an ending. Guadalcanal had been a promise. It became a pronouncement. The numbers are not the point, but they still speak. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached the mid-30,000s. Of those, tens of thousands died from combat, disease, and starvation in a proportion impossible to hide. American ground losses, around 1,600 killed and several thousand wounded, were grievous but sustainable, and the U.S. Navy's losses in the surrounding waters were paid back by the simple fact that Henderson Field survived each attempt to silence it. From the moment the first Wildcats landed there, the clock began to run against Japan. What did it all mean to the people who endured it? Japanese officers and enlisted men who survived and later wrote or spoke about the campaign returned to several truths with painful consistency. They had underestimated American fighting qualities. They had overestimated the power of spiritual training and night tactics against an enemy who could coordinate fire across ground he had measured and registered. Their logistics were never designed for a sustained campaign against an opponent who controlled daylight at sea and in the air. And most devastatingly, they had believed that courage would bridge the gap between resources and results. Guadalcanal proved that courage, while necessary, is not a plan. American veterans carried away different lessons without forgetting who they had faced. They learned that they could stand in the jungle against a determined enemy, that combined arms work when practiced and supplied, that medical systems and replacement pipelines matter as much as marksmanship. They also learned to respect an adversary who could starve and still attack, who would not surrender, who would crawl forward with a grenade when food and medicine were gone. The island itself wore the history for decades. Wrecked planes and ships thick in the surrounding waters, old positions swallowed by vines. And at the center, Henderson Field expanded and hardened into a base for further Allied moves up the Solomons. The war rolled on to New Georgia, to Bougainville, to the Bismarcks, and beyond. But the template had been stamped. Find the airfield or build one. Feed it. Defend it to own daylight. Use daylight to choke the enemy at night. Let logistics tilt the field until it becomes a slide. In staff colleges and history books, Guadalcanal is a case study in amphibious assault, jungle fighting, joint logistics, and night surface warfare. Those categories matter. Yet the more human conclusion is smaller and sharper. War will reward the side that turns courage into a system, that makes the individual act part of a network of fires, supplies, medicine, and information. On Guadalcanal, the Imperial Japanese Army met that kind of war and found that the night, once its ally, had learned to betray it. Somewhere in the last days of the campaign, a Japanese private whose name did not survive wrote in a diary that did, "We are hungry every day. There is no medicine. The Americans do not stop firing. We attack again tonight." The sentence holds the whole campaign in its tight hands, will and pain and misunderstanding. They attacked again. On Guadalcanal, it was not enough. Before the Marines set foot on Guadalcanal, the war had taught the Japanese a set of lessons that seemed universal. In China, speed and aggression had broken lines that were thin in men and thinner in spirit. In Southeast Asia, the same method, night marches, flanking through jungle, bayonet charges that arrived where planners said they could not, had cracked British, Dutch, and American formations already stressed by distance. The empire moved on rails of momentum. Its soldiers believed, with evidence, that shock at the right moment could break any enemy regardless of the ledger of tanks and factories. The American system they were about to meet was still under construction. The 1st Marine Division arrived tired from long sail, short on some essentials, and blind to much of what the island would demand. They learned fast. They built a perimeter around Henderson Field using rivers and ridges as anchors, cutting fields of fire into elephant grass, and turning coconut log revetments into machine gun nests. Engineers finished the runway under bombardment. Seabees and Marine pioneers filled craters, rolled pierced steel planking into place, and dragged wrecks off the strip so the next plane could lift off. The system took shape in sweat and repetition. The jungle imposed its own doctrine. Visibility fell to feet. Maps lied. Compass bearings went crooked under canopy, and rain erased tracks while leaving leeches. Movement became noise discipline and patience. Offensive action required bringing artillery to ground that could hold it, because no patrol, however brave, could stand unaided against a counterattack in green so thick it hid platoons at 15 paces. Those truths punished both sides. They rewarded the side that could fold patience into planning and bring fire to places that looked unreachable. A warning shot against overconfidence came early. On August 12th, a reconnaissance led by Lieutenant Colonel Frank Getch pushed west of the perimeter to test reports of surrendering Japanese. They landed near the Matanicaw and were cut to pieces almost as soon as they were ashore. Few men returned. The event, remembered as the Getch Patrol, drove home a rule that would hold for the whole campaign. Nothing outside the wires was safe, and any movement beyond them without prepared support would be paid for in blood. In the air, the Cactus Air Force became a study in rugged improvisation. The strip turned to soup and rain. Pilots took off through smoke and dust from bomb splinters. Ground crews worked with whatever parts they could scavenge and invent. Wildcats clawed with Zeros in the thin light after dawn and before dusk when the enemy's range allowed. And P-39/P-50 Airacobras, less loved elsewhere, proved deadly at low altitude, strafing landing barges, columns, and gun positions. SBD Dauntless dive bombers hit shipping off Tassafaronga and Kahili and threw back raids that would otherwise have smothered the Marines. Coast Watchers, Allied agents, and Solomon Islanders posted on surrounding islands, sent radio warnings when Japanese formations lifted from Rebel, giving Henderson a precious half hour to get planes airborne and warm the guns. The night of 13 to 14 October delivered the worst bombardment the Marines would endure. Two fast battleships, Congo and Haruna, slipped down the slot and rained thousands of shells onto Henderson Field. Aircraft burned in rows. Fuel dumps exploded. Craters pocked the runway until it seemed impossible a wheel could roll over it without vanishing. Dawn found ground crews already at work. By afternoon, patched Wildcats were taking off again. The point was not that the air raid failed. It did not. The point was that the system preferred repair to despair. Henderson Field, battered and scarred, refused to stay dead. Logistics, the dull keystone of victory, made all the differences that courage could not. American transports came under threat and at times were pushed away, but when they could run, they disgorged thousands of tons that spread through dumps under camouflage netting, ammunition pyramids, medical tents, fuel drums. Food in cans that tasted like boredom but kept men fighting. Japanese destroyers sprinted superbly but brought what their decks could bear: men, rifles, a few crates of shells. When they tried to float supply drums ashore to be pulled in by swimmers and grapnels, currents and American fire turned the drum method into a cruel gamble. The result was a law as hard as granite. Japanese units could concentrate men for nights at a time, but they could not sustain fire or eat enough to keep weight on their bones. The longer a fight lasted, the more the system, not spirit, decided. The interplay of raids around the Matanicaw River illustrates the point. Through September and October, both sides sparred there in brutal seesaws. The river's mouths, ridges, and ravines formed a natural grate that shredded anyone careless. Marines learned to cross with artillery and armor poised to fire, to withdraw under cover and let pre-laid barges slice pursuit to ribbons. Japanese forces, short of shells, could inflict pain and did, ambushes, envelopments at night, but too often found themselves forced to break contact at dawn when air and artillery pushed them flat. Each skirmish taught the same conclusion. The side that managed to bring combined arms to bear decided when the fight ended and on whose terms. Culture threaded through tactics. Japanese doctrine prized offense. The idea that a swift bayonet attack at night could shatter cohesion that daylight had failed to crack. American doctrine, even when forced into defense by logistics or design, turned that offensive into a timetable, kill zones mapped in advance, preliminary fires rehearsed, counterattacks planned. What felt to a charging soldier like chaos was in fact a schedule written in grease pencil on a map board in a dugout. That was the terror many survivors described later, not the bullets by themselves, but the sense that they were walking into a plan. It is tempting to reduce Guadalcanal to famous names. You hear Van de Grift, Edson, Puller, Basilone, and you think the story is simple, a handful of men holding a line with grit. The reality is wide. The Americol Division, an army formation whose full name, American New Caledonia, became Americol, brought the 164th, later the 182nd and 132nd Infantry Regiments into the perimeter. Their arrival changed everything. Fresh battalions thickened lines worn to threads by disease and exhaustion. Army artillery cracked open bunkers and tree lines the Marines had learned to fear. By late October, the defense of Henderson Field was no longer a Marine story or an Army story, but the joint story that would repeat across the Pacific. Marines to seize and hold, the Army to reinforce, expand, and carry on, the Navy and air to bind them and cover them. Terrain played favorites only with the prepared. The Lunga perimeter was never a simple circle, but a living organism that flexed with threat. It used the Ilu/Tenaru and the Matanikau as teeth. It used ridges as vertebrae. It bit with fields of fire that seemed to regenerate even after bombardments that should have knocked them out for days. When the perimeter moved forward, it did so with tools, engineers clearing lanes, mortars moving with handcarts, pack howitzers broken down across ravines and reassembled under leaves. On the other side, Japanese infantry units suffered a paradox. They were individually skilled, doctrinally committed, and capable of marching at speeds that shocked their opponents. But their formations were brittle under sustained losses because their supply chain could not backfill casualties with food and ammunition. Officers tossed plans into the fire of necessity. The result was often courage expended at the wrong place at the wrong time. Attacks launched to meet a deadline from above rather than a condition on the ground. When those attacks met layered fire, they burned without moving the line. The seas around Guadalcanal became a rotating stage of reinforcement and punishment. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in late August prevented a large reinforcement and bought Henderson time. The Battle of Cape Esperance in October showed American cruisers learning to use radar to punch first at night. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands at the end of October cost the U.S. precious carriers and air crews, but also blunted Japanese air power so far from home that damaged planes and pilots were too often lost to the ocean on the long return to Rabaul. Each fight at sea echoed on the beaches and ridges. When Japanese bombers could not suppress Henderson, the runway lifted planes at dawn. When American ships could not linger, the perimeter tightened and waited. Technology did not replace courage, it organized it. SG surface search radar let American destroyers see first and shoot first in the blackness. Fire control radars turned 5-inch turrets into instruments of geometry instead of guesswork. Radios linked an observer with a map and a pencil to a battery that could throw steel miles away. None of those devices meant anything without the men to run them under stress. Radar men reading ghosts on cathode screens in rooms so dark you could hear your own blood. Gun crews indexing dials with fingers blistered from heat. Linemen repairing cut wires in rain with shells stepping toward them across a valley. The system was made of people. As the campaign lengthened, the human ledger tilted further. American units rotated men to the rear when they could. Rations remained adequate. Mail arrived in sacks that smelled like ship. The Japanese could not rotate, could not feed the line, and could not promise their wounded anything but morphine when it existed. Many diaries from the period narrow to a single topic, food. A soldier might begin the war writing about training and comradeship. On Guadalcanal his hand scribbles about rice, then about leaves, then about roots and bark. The sentences grow thinner. The handwriting itself starves. The disease ledger was cruel to both sides. Malaria took Marines and soldiers down to fevers and chills that shook teeth loose. Dysentery flattened ranks. Fungal infections opened sores that would not close in the humidity. But those problems feed on logistics as surely as men do. Quinacrine and quinine arrived for the Americans even when they arrived late. Sulfa drugs made the difference between a wound and a funeral. Field hospitals cut infections away with the promise of evacuation. For the Japanese, with their supply line ambushed by daylight and constricted by doctrine, medicine became a rumor. Doctors amputated for lack of antibiotics, and the line outside grew longer. The stories of individuals sharpened the edges of the larger narrative. Sergeant John Basilon's night at the line south of Henderson Field is often told for its heroism. Dragging ammunition through fire, repairing and manning guns, counterattacking by pistol when positions buckled. Less told is the system around him that made that heroism decisive. Runners who found the right stack of belts in the dark. artillery observers who pushed barrages out 100 yards and then reeled them back in 20 at a time, Army riflemen from the 164th who filled the gaps as Marine machine gun crews dwindled, medics who turned the wounded around and sent them rearward along footpaths marked only in memory. Basilon's courage mattered because the web around him held. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's preparation of the ridge mattered in the same way. He did not trust to chance. He positioned guns not just where terrain suggested, but where fields of fire overlapped enough to let one position go dark without opening a door. He registered mortar and artillery fire in depth, not just on the forward slope. He ordered fallback positions plotted and dug before they were needed so that when the line bent, it bent onto something. A myth says the ridge was saved by will alone. The truth is that Will sat inside a plan. On the Japanese side, staff officers wrestled with the implications even as they wrote orders for the next attack. Some, like Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, would later write with a mixture of pride and denial. Others would quietly admit that the operation's premises had been wrong. The Tokyo Express could deliver men, but not massed artillery. It could deliver bayonets, but not the shells to prepare an assault or the food to hold ground. Naval superiority at night did not translate into control of the day. An army built to strike and move found itself gnawing a perimeter that regrew teeth by sunrise. Even outside the obvious battles, 1,000 small moments show how systems shape outcomes. Coast watchers, Australians like Martin Clemens and Solomon Islanders, whose names too often went unrecorded, hid radios under leaves and sent warnings that let Henderson scramble fighters before bombs fell. American engineers learned which patches of ground drained quickest, where to lay pierced steel planking so that wheels did not vanish in mud, how to move a wreck with trucks that barely had fuel. Signalmen worked a switchboard that knitted foxholes to batteries and to ships offshore. Messmen learned the alchemy of turning cans into calories a sick man could keep down. The Japanese learned similar small arts. Camouflage that could hide a company at 20 paces, jungle paths threaded between listening posts, night approaches that took hours for 100 yards. But their most important need could not be met by craft. They needed tonnage, and daylight forbade it. The campaign's conclusion, Operation Coup, deserves attention not as an epilogue, but as a counterpoint. The evacuation was a crisp piece of staff work and seamanship, an admission wrapped in skill. Destroyers ran hard nights to lift more than 10,000 men off beaches washed by American patrols. Deception blurred intentions. Small attacks and feints fixed American attention while the real work went on. For those who boarded the ships, the retreat tasted like rescue. For those too sick to move, it tasted like abandonment. Diaries become quiet here. Some write about the taste of broth. Some write nothing at all. When American patrols finally realized in early February that the trenches opposite had gone silent and that the jungle no longer spoke Japanese, Major General Alexander Patch sent a message to Admiral William F. Halsey that read like the closing of a door. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The words were plain. The meaning was profound. The Allies had seized the initiative and would not relinquish it again. What does Guadalcanal teach beyond its own hills and beaches? It teaches that offensive spirit cannot substitute for supply, that night tactics meet their limits when met by prepared fires, that airfields are not just real estate, but factories for daylight control, and that an army's medical system is as much a weapon as its guns. It teaches that a navy that learns to fight in the dark with radar will change what night means. It teaches that the measure of a plan is not its beauty before the first shot, but its resilience after the 5th week. It also teaches respect. American veterans emerged with a sober admiration for Japanese soldiers who attacked through hunger and marched through fever, who held trenches on calories that would have put most men on a stretcher, who chose death rather than surrender because that is what their world demanded of them. Japanese veterans emerged with a revised view of their enemy and, sometimes, of their own leadership. They spoke about systems, about the shock of seeing replacement barrels arrive for a machine gun, of watching American medics stabilizing a wounded man who would have been left behind, of hearing artillery arrive again and again with the regularity of a tide. They never seemed to run out, one remembered in later years. That sentence carries no malice, only awe and fatigue. Decades later, historians still walk the ridges and sandbars with notebooks. They note where the line actually bent and where memoirs have polished recollection into legend. They find cartridge cases in soil that has grown back 1,000 greens. They talk to islanders whose grandparents pointed them to places where the earth still feels brittle underfoot. The lessons remain, not as slogans, but as methods. Build a perimeter that is a plan, not a circle. Map fires before you need them. Err on the side of more medical supplies. Make your airfield a machine that can stand up after bombardment. Train your Navy to fight before it can see. Trust courage, but harness it. In the end, Guadalcanal sits at the hinge of the Pacific War not only because it was first, but because it explained the rest. New Georgia, Bougainville, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, each would repeat the formula in different terrain with larger fleets and heavier air. The system that broke the spell of invincibility in the jungle would grow larger, more practiced, and even more pitiless. Japanese forces would continue to fight with bravery, but they would increasingly do so inside a vice they could not pry open. The story returns, at last, to a young officer's diary at Taiva Point. In his first entries, he wrote about confidence, about a timetable that assumed a night assault and a dawn victory. His last entries, if they survived, would have been shorter. The jungle had a way of narrowing words. If he lived to write them, he might have written about the shock of hearing machine guns that did not stumble, of seeing what looked like empty grass erupt with shells pre-aimed at where he stood, of watching dawn bring airplanes that hunted as if by instinct. He would not have written about failure as weakness. He would have written about meeting a war built differently. That is Guadalcanal's final note. It is not that one side was brave and the other was not. It is that bravery by itself ran out faster than food, shells, and fuel. The Americans fought with systems that wrapped around their courage. The Japanese fought with courage that too often fought alone. In that difference lay the outcome. The air war over Guadalcanal deserves its own chapter because every morning and afternoon sortie wrote invisible orders for the ground. The Cactus Air Force did not enjoy the sleek superiority of later years. Its fighters were often outclimbed and outturned by Japanese Zeros. Its bombers were patched veterans flying with instruments that fogged in the heat. Its pilots slept in dugouts between raids and learned to launch through smoke from the last bombardment. Yet it fought, and, crucially, it was there. Presence is a kind of weapon. When Coast Watchers signaled that a raid was inbound from Bougainville or Rabaul, someone at Henderson could push a phone into a pilot's hand and say, "Go." The runway might be cratered. The men might be dragging a new flap onto a Dauntless with its paint still blistered from the night's shelling. Go still meant go. The pattern settled into something like liturgy. At dawn, armed reconnaissance looked down the slot for barges or destroyers that had gone too slow. By mid-morning, the first Japanese raid tested the strip. Wildcats clawed up and met them, sometimes with P-39/Peking West coming in lower and angrier. After noon, SBDs went hunting ships and dumps. At dusk, another raid came, and Henderson's guns, 37s, 90s, and everything in between, made the sky over the runway dangerous for anyone who flew through it. At night, what could not fly hid? Bombardment might flatten revetments and chew the runway, but the dawn ritual resumed unless the field was truly smashed. Too often for the Japanese plan, it was not. The air also carried a quieter current, the flow of information. Photographs taken from SBDs showed where Japanese dumps were growing at Tasamboko, before Edson's raiders struck them. Reports from pilots about campfires and movement along river mouths cued artillery that would otherwise have spent shells on guesswork. Radios knitted ships, guns, and squadrons into a loose but real web that flexed under pressure rather than breaking. There were moments when American confidence thinned to threads. The night after Savo Island, with the offshore horizon flickering and nothing friendly in sight, Marines looked at the stacks of crates and then at the empty beach and understood the math. "We're on our own" is not a slogan. It is a weight on the chest. Rations were cut. Ammunition became something you thought about when you pulled the trigger. Men built foxholes as if their lives depended on them because they did. It is worth saying plainly, without Henderson Field, without the ability to own daylight at sea, Watchtower might have become a footnote about an audacious raid that failed. With it, the perimeter became a magnet that pulled tonnage south and forced an empire to bleed to hold the initiative. Not every American decision landed cleanly. Commanders argued the balance between aggressive patrolling and needless risk. The Metanikaw, in particular, punished assumptions. One operation surged forward on maps and then recoiled when real ravines and interlocking fields of fire proved that the ground would be bought only yard by yard. Marines and soldiers learned a proverb the hard way: what you can't see can kill you anyway. Their response, more artillery, better scouts, closer coordination, took time to mature. Japanese commanders, too, argued fiercely among themselves, not over courage but over priorities, whether to smash the airfield outright or to isolate it, whether to attack along the coast where tanks might support, or through the interior where surprise at night might compensate for lack of shell. Strategy bent to schedule and to the hunger that struck both plans from the margin notes. Henderson's survival through October and November came at the price of terrifying nights. The bombardment by Congo and Haruna is remembered for its scale, but there were lesser nights when cruisers and destroyers clawed the air with high explosive and shrapnel until tents lay flat and ears rang for days. Pilots learned to sleep with boots on. Ground crews dug deeper. Medical staff hauled litter after litter through trenches so shallow they filled with rain when the sky frowned. Two truths persisted after the dust settled. First, that the field could be hurt badly. Second, that it recovered faster than anyone attacking it had calculated. The miscalculation repeated so often it stopped looking like an error and started looking like a structural flaw in Japanese planning. November stretched the pattern to breaking. In the naval battle of Guadalcanal, both sides bled steel in measureless night fights. On the first night, American and Japanese formations collided at ranges so close that searchlights illuminated paint and men on opposing decks. The next night and the next, battles that textbooks would later parse into phases smeared together into one long, dark wrestling match with radar and searchlights for hands. For the Japanese, the goal was simple: smash Henderson Field and land a division with its heavy equipment. For the Americans, the goal was simpler still: don't let them. When Washington's 16-inch guns found Hiroshima at last and began to write giant answers into the dark, the naval portion of the campaign crossed an invisible line. The remaining Japanese transports beached, burned, and died under air attack and shell. Men ashore read the sky and knew what it meant. The chance at a decisive reinforcement had died at sea. On land, the Americol and the 2D Marine Division pushed outward. Coley Point turned from a Japanese hope into an American base. The hunt along the Metanikaw settled into a grim, methodical rhythm. Push, register, push again, until Japanese positions that had been strong by stealth were simply no longer there. January saw a coordinated American offensive that exploited this steady erosion. The Japanese still fought hard, ambushing and slipping away in ways that commanded respect, but their ammo pouches were thin and their bellies were empty. The offensive did not so much break the line as realize that the line had already cracked from hunger. Many myths have accreted around Guadalcanal, and dispelling a few honors the men who were actually there. First, that American victory was inevitable because of industry. Industry made victory sustainable, not inevitable. Mistakes at Savo and elsewhere demonstrate how quickly a richer fleet can be surprised and punished. What turned industry into victory on Guadalcanal was the stubbornness to repair, the discipline to plan, and the willingness to learn inside the fight. Second, that Japanese tactics were simplistic or bonsai charges without thought. The reality shows repeated attempts at infiltration, envelopment, and coordination under miserable conditions. The failure was not of courage or intelligence, it was of logistics and timing. A third myth, that the jungle itself plays favorites, collapses under close reading. The jungle is equal opportunity malicious. It rots boots, eats maps, and deafens men. It favors the side that respects its indifference and prepares anyway. The Marines and soldiers who survived learned to keep dry socks in oilskin, to salt food that came out of a can so their bodies would not cramp, to sleep in short stretches so that a dawn attack did not find them all exhausted at once. Japanese veterans learned a parallel craft of movement and concealment. Both sides mastered pieces of the environment. Only one side could keep replacing what the environment consumed. The casualty figures, always imperfect, tell a moral caution. American dead on land numbered in the low thousands when you include the army units that arrived later, with many more wounded and sick. Naval losses in ships and sailors were catastrophic and, at times, felt unbearable to those fighting the sea war. Japanese deaths on the island and in the surrounding waters ran into the tens of thousands, with a heartbreaking share from starvation and disease. Statistics are poor translators of misery, but they keep us from pretending that one side bled cheaply. Neither did. The difference lay in what those losses purchased. On the American side, losses bought an airfield that stayed open, a fleet that learned, and a template for the island hopping to come. On the Japanese side, too many losses bought courage proven again and again at the edge of a system that could not support it. For the viewer trying to understand the feeling of the campaign, imagine three sounds. First, the drone of a Wildcat circling at dusk, its pilot counting the minutes of fuel left, waiting to see if the dots on the horizon are friends coming home or enemies arriving. Second, the chopped, wet pulse of a water-cooled Browning at night, firing in bursts that blur into a continuous rasp, steam ghosting from the jacket. Third, the rustle of palm fronds in a wind that carries the smell of decay and cordite in equal parts. Those sounds, air, gun, jungle, composed the soundtrack of Guadalcanal. In the years after the war, many Japanese officers wrote with candor about their mistakes. They argued about whether the decision to evacuate came too late, about whether a greater emphasis on suppressing Henderson earlier, by concentrating bombardments and air raids, would have changed outcomes. Some believe that the Tokyo Express should have been abandoned sooner in favor of a single, massively escorted convoy early in the campaign. Others replied that even if such a convoy had arrived, the Americans would have strangled it afterward, turning one large defeat into a slow grind anyway. The most honest voices agreed on one thing: systems decide campaigns when courage meets courage. American veterans, for their part, tended to minimize rhetoric and to talk instead about details that civilians might miss, but soldiers immediately understand. They spoke about how the best leaders checked on the men at the furthest, dampest foxholes rather than hovering over maps. They praised quartermasters who found a way to get new boots forward and medics who nagged men to take their anti-malaria pills even when the pills tasted like poison. They described the relief of hearing a battery fire when you called for it, and the surprising civility of a letter from home in the same week you thought you might not see another sunrise. Their Guadalcanal was less a myth than a memory of stacked cans, hot barrels, and rain. After Guadalcanal, the Pacific War accelerated. The same logic repeated at larger scales. Build an airfield and own the day and choke the night. Use destroyers to raid, carriers to shield, submarines to strangle. Feed the line. Treat wounded men. Replace burnt gun barrels. Rotate units. The industrial base behind those verbs grew into a tidal force. Japan's base did not. Courage persisted on both sides. The outcomes, in the Gilberts and Marshalls, at the Marianas, in Leyte Gulf, followed the logic the jungle had made plain. The Guadalcanal story also includes fights that unfolded just out of frame from the main runway, each a shard that catches the wider light. Across Iron Bottom Sound at Talagi, Gavutu, and Tenambogo, Marine raiders and parachutists waded ashore on the first day under fire from well-sighted positions. The struggle there, close quarters, grenade by grenade, prefigured what the main island would see. Dug-in positions that had to be reduced by coordination and grit, small bays that turned into killing grounds if approached without smoke or supporting fire, defenders who would not surrender when the battle turned. Securing those islets gave the Americans anchorages and observation posts that mattered out of proportion to their size. The campaign, from its opening hours, was a mosaic more than a single image. Life inside the perimeter settled into a rhythm that outsiders would not recognize as routine. Men learned the smell of coming rain and of shell bursts, the metallic taste that rides the air after an explosion. They learned to read the jungle's mood, when birds fell silent, when insects buzzed wrong. They ate from cans stenciled with codes, joked darkly about recipes for hash that tasted the same no matter what the label said, and traded for fresh fruit from islanders when they could. Mail calls were both balm and a blade. A letter from home could steady a man or make him feel the distance more sharply. Cholera of the mind, fear, exhaustion, homesickness was as real as any tropical fever and leadership meant dealing with that as much as with trench lines and patrol routes. The islanders' contributions were not limited to intelligence. Carriers manhandled supplies over trails where even mules failed. Solomon Islanders guided patrols along routes that maps did not admit existed and carried wounded men in litters through ravines that would have broken most Westerners. Names like Jacob Vuza belong in the same breath as the most decorated Marines for the simple reason that without such allies, the perimeter would have been blinder and the casualty list longer. War is always coalition work, and Guadalcanal's coalition included people who did not wear American uniforms. The Japanese side, too, drew on local knowledge and improvisation with courage that deserves clear eyes. Units carved shelters into coral and hid gun pits under slung canvas and living branches. Patrols ghosted into the tall grass at twilight and returned at dawn with sketches of American lines that were remarkable in detail given the conditions. Carpenters turned coconut logs into revetments that survived bombardments, which shredded the foliage above. Physicians invented treatments with almost nothing, boiling instruments when fuel existed, using alcohol as antiseptic, pleading for quinine that the sea stole away. If the system failed, the people inside it still strove to make it work, and their failure indicts the design, not the effort. Some of the most painful episodes came when learned habits collided with new realities. Japanese night attacks had conquered cities and forts across Asia. In the blackness along the Tenru and atop Bloody Ridge, those same attacks found that the enemy had learned to wait with overlapping machine guns and mortar fires that fell in patterns too perfect to be accidental. Officers trained to seek decision by dawn instead found dawn bringing fighters and dive bombers. Tactical excellence met operational starvation. That friction shredded formations that could not be replaced. The Americans, for their part, learned caution in the face of clever opponents. After early missteps along the Matanikau, operations there improved. Companies crossed only under covering fires. Pullbacks were planned rather than improvised, and the habit of pushing reconnaissance patrols without. Ready support fell out of fashion. Leaders walked ground before they asked men to die on it. The perimeter expanded not by accident, but by a method that matched means to goals with an accountant's ruthlessness. A campaign is a sequence of bargains. Guadalcanal offered both sides awful terms. The Japanese bargained courage for time and found the exchange unfair. The Americans bargained ships for a runway and paid in cruisers and destroyers that slid into iron-bottom sound in the dark. Their names later read aloud by survivors who could never quite believe the list was that long. Yet from those bargains, a direction emerged. Japan could still slash at the Allied advance, could still surprise and sting and force delays, but the long arithmetic now worked against them. Guadalcanal changed the sign on the war's ledger. There is a way to misunderstand the system that won here, as if it were a machine that ran itself. It was not. It was the sum of men laying logs for a revetment, when their hands bled, of cooks who made breakfast for crews who had not slept, of ordnance men who learned by feel when a spring would fail, of medics who wrote the same letter, "Your son is alive," a dozen times with different names, of pilots who took off knowing that a flak burst could turn the next second into fire, of sailors who watched the black horizon and trusted a radar set they could not see to tell them when to shoot. System is simply courage organized. Strategy after Guadalcanal bent around that organizing principle. In Tokyo, the inner defense perimeter contracted as planners accepted that they could not garrison every atoll and mountain chain with enough mass to resist a sustained, combined arms assault backed by carrier decks and factories. In Washington, island hopping became more than a briefing slide. It became budget lines, training cycles, and shipbuilding priorities. The early pain on the slot echoed in the decision to build faster destroyers and more fleet oilers, to train radar operators until night fighting no longer felt like witchcraft, to stockpile aviation spare parts like ammunition. When veterans on both sides returned to the island decades later, they found shrines, markers, and in some places still the outlines of foxholes. They met men who had tried to kill them and discovered that time can turn enemies into fellow witnesses. They stood on the sandbar at the Ilha's mouth and tried to see what their younger eyes had seen. They climbed the ridge and felt again the wind that had swung the grasses during the long nights. Some left offerings. Some left nothing because they had already left too much. If you are looking for a single sentence to carry away, take this. Guadalcanal is where the Imperial Japanese Army learned that the Americans would not break at night, and where the Americans learned that courage means more when it is part of a plan. Everything else, the ships, the planes, the names, the dates, matters, but it matters in service of that lesson. The Pacific War after Guadalcanal moved faster, grew larger, and became more mechanized, but the core remained. Hold the airfield, feed the airfield, and let daylight write orders that the night will obey. Epilogue. Lessons beyond 1942. Modern readers sometimes ask whether an island campaign waged with bolt-action rifles and dive bombers can still teach in an era of satellites and precision weapons. Guadalcanal's answer is yes. Technology changes the tools. It does not change the basics. Someone still has to build an airfield and keep it working under fire. Someone still has to turn supplies into combat power at the right place and time. Someone still has to plan the geometry of fire before the enemy arrives. And someone still has to carry a wounded friend to a surgeon who has what he needs. The jungle standardized those truths and made them visible. That is why Guadalcanal endures. It shows how a military culture that worshipped Elon and night could be unmade by an opponent who had, in the words of one Japanese officer, learned to fight with systems instead of fury. The men in the story returned to lives with quieter rhythms: fishing, factory shifts, classrooms, farms. Or else they did not return at all. Their experiences wrote training syllabi and doctrine, but they also wrote private ethics about endurance and care. When you hear a veteran say, "We held," what you are hearing is not a boast about one night or one ridge. You are hearing a whole web of people who made holding possible.